accessible and available to all. We're going to record this presentation. We're going to get the captions, make it accessible, and then upload it to our YouTube channel, and we'll email it to everyone after so that they can rewatch at their leisure, in case we go too fast. Okay. Little agenda. We're going to do welcome introductions, where we are now. In a minute, I'm going to launch a poll to assess your guys' knowledge about the CWDG grant and just give us a better idea of how we can maybe work to close some gaps in knowledge. We're going to go a quick overview of just what the CWDG grant is, the Community Wildfire Defense Grant, for folks who may not be too familiar with it. We're going to pause a little bit for questions after that. And then we're going to dive into some tips and some best practices based on our knowledge and some knowledge that we've collected from some other subject matter experts. And then we're going to do another poll, and we'll just open it up for questions from you guys. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll. It's real quick. It's just about 5 questions. I already noticed a typo, so please forgive me. I'm definitely have some typos going on. But anyway, while you guys are taking that poll, I wanted to introduce your speakers. So I already mentioned my name is Megan Kay. I am the outreach coordinator for the Living with Fire program at the University of Nevada, Reno Extension. I'm going to be talking a little bit, but really who is your main presenter here today is going to be Donald Lovejoy, and I'll let Donald introduce himself.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. So my name is Donald Lovejoy. I am the Community Wildfire Defense Grant Coordinator with the Nevada Division of Forestry.
Awesome. So Donald, so the Nevada Division of Forestry is the administrator for the Community Wildfire Defense Grant in Nevada, right?
Yeah, correct. If you're in Nevada, you'll most likely be working with me at some point in your application.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why we're excited to have Donald on. He's definitely the person to answer your questions about applying for grants in Nevada. We might have some, I know I spoke to a few people who are from Tahoe, so we might have some Tahoe specific questions and some California questions. We're not California experts, but we do have some expertise in the room, some folks who've worked extensively in Tahoe, so we're hoping that we can answer those questions. But yeah, just to manage your expectations, we're not necessarily subject matter experts about applying for the grants in California. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead. Oh, we have a few other people that are trickling in. Oops. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. I'm not going to share the results because they're just for our purposes. And we're going to dive into the overview of the Community Wildfire Defense Grant. So I'm going to hand it off to Donald.
Yeah, so the Community Wildfire Defense Grant was created from the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as a new federal program designed to assist at-risk communities and tribes to plan and reduce the risk of wildfire and to help implement a mitigation project as part of a community wildfire protection plan. So the U.S. Forest Service has approximately $250 million available for this year, for this round. And this is a fairly competitive opportunity. It's usually ranked nationally. So there's last year, there's quite a few applicants, and we expect the same for this round. So organizations that can really apply for this, we're talking about local government, ones that have land ownership or support the management of land that represents communities located in area at risk for wildfire, any tribal governments, nonprofit organizations, including homeowner associations. We have state forestry partners, as well as Alaska Native corporations. Not sure if there's many in there on this call, but so those are the basic eligibility for organizations. And basically, the opportunity is separated out into two separate buckets of funding. There is either projects that can be used to either update or develop a community wildfire protection plan. So these are kind of one of the fundamental building blocks. I won't read this for word to word, but basically it helps communities in their planning. It has components of collaboration with partners, and it just helps to put together a plan around the risk of wildfires. So for this bucket, if you're thinking about maybe developing or creating one for your community, you have to have, if you do have a CWPP, it has to be at least 5 years old to apply for this bucket. But you can essentially also work to develop one if you don't have one. For project implementation, this project, it has to be described in a community wildfire protection plan. That's really the key there. And it has to be less than 10 years old. One thing to note is if you don't have a CWPP for projects, you may also have a hazard mitigation plan, or there might be an equivalent tribal plan. It's important to note that those projects will still need to be described in those plans. So there must be some sort of wildfire component within that document. And if you, Megan, if you want to click on the link there, just to show you, this is the Forest Service's page that has a lot more information. A couple of things on this page I would note is you can actually go back and look at past applications, but you can also see what projects were funded. So that might give you a little bit of an idea of the scope of what we're looking at when we're coming to awarded or funded projects. There's also some other resources there, including some past webinars that you can go back and listen to as well.
Yeah, sorry for scrolling so fast. I was trying to find that section you were referencing. I had a question real quick. So for the CWPP plan, I just wanted to clarify something. This is also, if you don't, you mentioned that a CWPP had to be less than 5 years old. I just wanted to check that. So if you're applying to create a CWPP, you could just not have one, right? And this could be, you could get funding to create one. Gotcha. It's just that it's for the project implementation one that it has to be, your CWPP or hazard mitigation plan has to be less than 10 years old, right?
Yeah, for the project, it has to be less than 10 years old. But if you have an existing CWPP, it has to be at least 5 years old to update it or to revise it.
Oh, otherwise you would have to create a completely new one. That's what you're saying, right? So if I had a CWPP from like 2005, which is a lot of Nevada counties have older CWPPs, if I applied through this grant, I wouldn't be able to update that CWPP. I would have to completely get a new one.
You can update it. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So it just has to be greater than 5 years is another way to put it.
Greater than 5 years.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was misunderstanding.
I might have said yes too. Less than 2.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. I'm going to go to the next slide now.
So that's kind of a very brief overview of the grant opportunity. If you're, in a community, if you're a homeowner looking at your maybe HOA to apply for this grant, or if you're with local government, I think there's some critical questions to ask yourself before you jump right into the application. And as we kind of started to talk about, the first one, very important, very simple. What's the status of your community wildfire protection plan? Or if you have a hazard mitigation plan or equivalent trouble plan. So for this, we do have a great website with Nevada Division of Forestry. It can outline that there's outlines of some past CWPPs in the state. There's also another page that can take you that will show the criteria of a CWPP as well. So if you're trying to get a little bit of better sense of them, that might help to understand them a little bit more.
Is that other page linked on this forestry.gov page?
It would be under, if you click on that link, there should be a link on the side. So if you go, I believe it's under the fire adapted partnerships. If you go up, fire adapted Nevada partnerships. And then I believe there should be a link there, right there.
Oh, here it is. Yeah.
Click on those. So this will kind of help you see some of the elements of a CWPP.
I'm going to go ahead and put that link in the chat. And then, so Nancy Gibson also had put a message in the chat for folks to review to clarify some of the things that we were talking about previously. Okay, go back to the presentation.
So that was the first question, understanding where you're at with a community wildfire protection plan. The next one is pretty simple as well. Who owns the land that the project would occur on? So the important piece here to note is that projects that occur on federal lands are generally not eligible. So usually what we're looking at for land ownership is really, it must fall within private, local, tribal, state government, or homeowner association ownership. So those are the key pieces there. Applying for a project on federal land would be not eligible for this opportunity. That's one. Have you reviewed the community's assessment on the CWDG data tool? So this is an important one to look at. For this year, if you were part of round one, this tool was not available. So this is a round two tool that they just Forest Service just put out for this competition. And it allows you to assess your criteria on the application for a number of questions. So Megan, if you want to type in you can type in a city, county, and it should populate some of the eligibility criteria. So the first one is a pretty basic one, whether or not you have a risk for wildfires. And so you can see here, Minden is considered at risk. It has a higher wildfire risk to homes than 90.2% of the communities in the nation. It gives you some GIS coordinates. This also kind of aligns with part of the application. Although for this, I would stress that for an application, if you have a project, it might be better to put coordinates within that project range if there's a particular area that's the work is being done at. Low-income community. So this is one of the priorities for the funding opportunity. If you qualify for low income, you receive an additional 10 points for the scoring, which might not sound significant, but the scoring is out of 100 points. So if you do not qualify for low income, then the highest you can get is 90, which makes a pretty big difference when you're looking at the scoring rubric on the Notice of Funding Opportunity page. There's two more. The next one is severe disaster impacts. So this relates to whether or not your community had been severely impacted by a disaster within the last 10 years. So this will give you a list of all the federally declared disasters. There might be other ones that are not included on this. And if you have documentation, let's say it was a state declared emergency or disaster, you might be able to add that in your application if it's not listed there. So it's important to note that this might not be an all-inclusive list. And then the last part there is the wildfire hazard potential. So this one's worth 20 points, and it's a big one. And again, it's the same as above when it relates to at-risk for wildfires. It'll say criteria has a higher wildfire risk to homes than 90.2% of communities in the nation. And then the last one that you saw on the screen there, this one kind of goes more into the budget side of things. So if you're a community that is either low income or underserved, then you may be eligible to apply for a cost share waiver. So that's important to know if you might not have the match available or looking for options there.
Oh, sorry.
And I was reading Kevin's question, and that's actually the data that they're pulling from that website. So for the underserved part of that, if we could maybe go back to the tool there, Megan. So the part of what gets pulled is from the cost share waiver. So you can see there it comes directly from the CJEST, which is the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool.
Awesome.
The next question that is a good one to ask, who would actually manage the project and take financial responsibility with the grant, including match requirements? So those match requirements, if you're planning to apply to develop or update a community wildfire protection plan, then there's a 10% non-federal match requirement. It's important to note the non-federal piece because most other federal grants that are out there do not qualify to be including as match on this grant. So it generally has to come from non-federal resources. If you're applying for a project that is requires a 25% non-federal match. Match waivers, as we discussed, are available and can be a great option if you're if it's been hard to try to find funds to support the project. And we can go to the next slide. All right, last two questions that are pretty good to ask yourself. Have you talked with your city? If you're like for example, if you're an HOA, it could be good talking to your city, county, or fire protection district in Nevada. They might have other resources or guidance or ability to help you work with them to support the application on CWDG. So it's good to kind of know who your partners are. And this really goes into one of the questions on the application as well, which is around collaboration. So within the application, you'll need to describe any partners that you're planning to work with as part of the implementation of it. So that could help strengthen your application and also kind of give you additional support. And then lastly, this one, just talking with me, everyone might have a particular focus on their projects, different needs. So it's worth just talking to me. Feel free to email or call me. I'll have my contact information at the end of the presentation. And I'll also just do a quick plug. Nevada Division of Forestry has a lot of different programs. We oversee a lot of different grant opportunities. So even if CWDG might not be the perfect fit, we might be able to talk about your needs and see if there's other programs out there that might support that.
Awesome. I just wanted to address one comment that was in the chat. So Nancy Gibson, I'm just going to introduce Nancy Gibson real quick too. We invited her here and we're excited that she's attending. She's the former supervisor for the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit and has a lot of expertise for applying for CWDG grants, has been doing a lot of webinars similar to this one. So she is, I'm grateful that she's kind of like a fly on the wall, commenting on things that we might be missing. So her comment is that tribal lands are given a nationwide cost share waiver. So this is different than the previous round. So all tribes should have a cost share waiver based on sort of the criteria of being underserved. Definitely.
And I should also point, if you attend any of those webinars that are on the Forest Service site there, those are great webinars because right out of the gate, the first few minutes, they actually talk about the changes from round 1 to round 2. So that can give you a good overview of what's different if you did apply last year or already familiar with the grant.
I did want to just take a quick pause because that was a lot to digest. There haven't been that many questions in the chat, but I wanted to give us, before we dive into our tips and best practices, I wanted to give an opportunity for someone to ask questions. So yes, go ahead. Unmute yourself, David.
Yeah, hi, I'm David Frankel. I'm the Fire Safety Committee Chair for the Spring Creek Tract Homeowners Association. We're located near Fallen Leaf Lake in South Lake Tahoe. We have gotten FireWise certification. We are on U.S. Forest Service land, and we have a huge problem with bark beetle infestation in firs and a massive amount of dead trees that we're unable to remove at this point. And the question I have for you, and I don't know if you can answer it or not, but we're really desperately looking for this, is why is there this prohibition on funding for people on federal land? We pay a lot of use fees and taxes for our cabins. We do not own the land that we're on. We're a nonprofit HOA. We're all set up in many ways. We have a large fire safety committee, and yet we're prohibited from getting funding from any of these sources. We've been looking for some time, and we've yet to find a grant that doesn't have this prohibition on funding for federal lands. And so we're kind of crippled in this. And any suggestions or thoughts you have either about why they're doing this, or can you get a waiver other places? It's just been very difficult for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
And I'm not, I don't know the background fully on, at least with this opportunity, but I would say one recommendation would be and I'm sure you might already be in contact with them, but talking to your local Forest Service district to see, there might be other options available, other programs that they might have that can support, kind of some of the needs there. That would be my recommendation if you haven't reached out to them already.
Yeah, my hunch, and actually I'm going to call out Nancy and ask her to unmute and give any response if she has, but my hunch would be that it has a lot to do with kind of like double dipping of funds, because federal lands already get money for wildfire risk and for hazard mitigation, especially around wildfire. I think that there might be some issues around that. Just kind of like, it might be problematic if you're on federal land, and like if the national forest that you're on that manages that land, if they're already getting funds for this, and if you're getting funds for that, that might be problematic. So Nancy asked if you would you mind messaging her directly in the chat and giving her your information, David?
Yeah, I will. That'd be great. Thank you very much. I don't want to take more time for the group. This is kind of an off.
No, it's a great question. And it's not one that comes up too much in Nevada, because I think with ranchers it might, because they are sort of living and working on public land, but it's definitely like it's a problem that we don't see that much. So I want to connect you with the right people. That's my hunch. That's my hunch, is that it has a lot to do with sort of, you can't be getting multiple sources.
This is Nancy. I could weigh in a little bit if that would be.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Nancy. I'm up in South Lake Tahoe, and I appreciate David's question. The interesting thing about this grant is it's part of a much bigger picture, and that bigger picture has to do with the National Cohesive Wildfire Management Plan. And as of last year, the emphasis that the Secretary of Agriculture and the Forest Service Chief has put on the wildfire crisis strategy. Under the wildfire crisis strategy, the first couple of rounds of funding coming from both the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as more recently, the Inflation Reduction Act, has pushed money into natural resources agencies for treatments on federal land. And they have emphasized a number of landscapes across the country. The California region has, I believe, what have we got, like 10 landscapes just in California alone. There's 21 total. And so there's already monies being invested on the federal land through those two funding sources. And because they're actively trying to basically promote an all hands, all lands approach, then these grants are coming out for the treatment on non-federal lands. And this is only one of several. Donald had mentioned, any other private landowner may want to contact him, because it's not just this grant, but this CWDG grant is going for a 5-year period, and we're only into round 2 right now. And there's a federal, it's actually a forest landowners support grant. It's on a 4-year plan, and the first year is rolling out right as we speak. So it's not just a one-shot deal. There's opportunities both for federal land managers to continue getting money, an influx of money to deal with federal lands, and non-federal land owners to also get money through these grant programs. So it is a bigger picture. And David, yes, if you provide me your contact information, I'll make sure you get tied into the program planning on federal lands to see what may be in store for the Fallen Leaf Lake area.
Thank you so much. That would be fantastic.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your question, and thanks for addressing that, Nancy. I think it's funny because we were corresponding and she actually mentioned that grant, and she's like, have you heard of it? And it's just interesting that a question about that grant came up in this conversation. So Megan, we can see your email. You can see my email. Oh, gotcha. Sorry. I'm going to close my email. Is everything, do you guys see my presentation on the screen? Everything?
Yeah, it's shown.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was looking up my correspondence with Nancy, and apparently I showed you guys all my inbox. So hopefully with that, there was nothing too crazy there. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and dive into some tips and tricks now. Does that sound good, Donald?
Well, I just wanted to pause to see if there's any other questions that folks might have.
Yeah. Let's see here.
And there'll be another time later on in the presentation to ask questions as well. So
yeah. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and dive in, and then if folks want to ask questions, feel free to put it in the chat. I'll let you take this too, because we're talking about some best practices.
Yeah. So here are some general tips. A lot of these might be pretty common sense, but I think they're good to point out, especially if maybe this is your first grant application that you're submitting. So make sure that you review all the resources. For this grant in particular, there's a lot of resources from the Forest Service. There's our state resources that we have here. There's just a lot of information, and as we're going through these next couple slides, you'll see links to quite a few of these. So just make sure you read all the material, understand what the opportunity is, and make sure that any questions that you direct them either to me or probably best would be to direct them to me. And the next piece there is just pay attention to the questions being asked on the application. There's actually a scoring rubric that the Forest Service included in the NOFO, and that's a great way to self-evaluate, self-score your application to see where you might be missing some of the information. And the rubric is really should be used with the application itself. There's questions associated with the application that might not be in the rubric, but it's still good to respond to those as well. And then also it's always good just to proofread and check for any grammar issues and make sure that it's as well written as possible. We do have a PDF of the application, which can be really helpful for writing a first draft before actually submitting it. So basically with this funding opportunity, there is an online portal that you would submit your final application in. But putting it in this PDF we can work together to, you can send it to myself and we can look at it together, and I can provide any potential feedback to help strengthen the application. Associated with the application, there's actually 17 sections. And every section on here is important to respond to, even if it's something that you might not know about or might not have a lot to provide on here. It's really important to read through each of those questions and prompts and respond to every single piece of that, even if they're not applicable. And then lastly, starting early, if you can provide a draft application to myself, I'm happy to review it. But essentially just don't wait for the last minute, because this application process, this NOFO funding opportunity, has a lot of complex parts to it. So the more feedback that we can provide to you, the better you're in for the application. It's a very competitive funding opportunity. And then this last piece here, we can kind of go into it a little bit more later on, but all of the applications are available from last year, and you can see how they scored. You might be able to get a sense of the level of detail that's needed in applications. You can also see a great idea also is to find a project that's pretty similar to your own, and you might be able to get some ideas or just some considerations there that you might not have thought about before. Just kind of seeing what other proposals are out there and just be able to understand them a little bit better. And so this is probably one of the most important parts of the application in my mind, is the project description. This really has a lot of information. And you can see here, this is straight from the application. And it has quite a few, I'm sure you all know, like the who, what, where, why, how. It's really all encompassing when it comes to describing that project. And if there's components of it that are not addressed, that really lowers the scoring on your application. It is also really important to note how your project not only aligns with your community wildfire protection plan if you're applying for a project, but also how it supports the cohesive wildland fire management strategy. I think, Nancy, you mentioned that before. There's actually a link in the NOFO if you'd like to go and read it. And then there's also a relevant state forest action plan. So in Nevada, we have one that you can look at, and it might be good to see how it compares with your project and see what parts of it can align with that as well. In California, I assume you have one. I'm not familiar with it, so I don't know if there's, Nancy, if you have any insight on California side, but I assume there's a California Forest Action Plan.
Would you or Sonara would be able to put the link to Nevada's in the chat? I'm not that familiar with the Forest Action Plan.
Yeah, I can, Sonara, if you have it. Otherwise, it might take me a second to look for it.
Yeah, I'm not current on a California state action
I'm
plan.
looking for it.
But I do know, similar to your previous slide, we've got a number of the counties I've primarily been working with in Northern California that have countywide community wildfire protection plans. And the interesting thing about the National Cohesive Strategy is it really came to the fore way back in 2000. And subsequent to that, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act came out in 2002 under the Bush administration. And that's where the emphasis on collaboration and development of community wildfire protection plans began to surface. So the cohesive plan has been around for a long time. It gets updated pretty routinely. And I think the latest update on it is January of 2023.
Thank you, Nancy. Donald, do you want to jump to the next one?
Yeah, and I just posted, and Sonara did as well, the forest action plan for Nevada.
Cool. All right.
We can probably move on.
There we go.
So I was talking about this earlier. The top possible score is 100 points. So you'll see here, every point matters when applying for this. You can go back to last year's. I don't want to speak incorrectly, but most of the applications that were awarded in round one had a score of, I think, 82 or higher, around there, somewhere around 82. So you can really see how if you get marked off points for not explaining anything in your application or not hitting all those questions, you can see how that really affects your overall scoring. The last three there, the last three there, low income community, severe disaster impact, wildfire hazard potential. Those three are either you get the full points or you don't. So it's important to look at that CWDG tool that we showed earlier, look at your community assessment and be able to use that to respond to those questions.
I had just a follow-up about this. If you do, I think that to have a strong application, you should obviously explicitly state if you have if you're low income community or your wildfire hazard potential. But are people checking on the other end? Like, for example, if you omit that in your application, but it turns out that your community does check that box, for folks that are scoring the applications, are they taking that in mind, or are they being oh, they forgot to mention it, but it actually is, so we're going to give them full points? Or do they still score it low because they didn't mention it in the application?
Yeah, it does need to be mentioned in the application. And so it's really important to address those questions. And they do get rolled up into the review process. So really think about those and ensure that you're addressing them. And I was going to say, those three make up 40 points, which is almost half the points that you can get on this funding opportunity. So it makes a big difference if you do qualify for those to really include it.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that the certain things might be obvious to you as a QDD member, especially if you live in a high fire hazard area, but they're not necessarily obvious to the people scoring the applications. So you got to make sure that they're explicitly stated in the application and you're not letting things go unspecified. So along that, this is something that I added that I really wanted to emphasize in this presentation, which is that the USDA, in addition to publishing, information about projects that were funded, they released a criteria of factors that made narratives score higher than others. So these are the factors that they included and these are factors in narratives that they basically found to create stronger applications. I'm going to click on this stock and I'm going to show you an example of how this looks. The reason I wanted to go through this with you guys is because I wanted to illustrate how these factors that the USDA has identified as making narrative score high, not all of them are explicitly stated within the project description. So you can potentially check all the boxes within the project description and still not have the strongest, most competitive application. So I really wanted to make sure that you're also paying attention to these factors that the USDA pointed out. So below here, we have an example of a top scoring narrative in a project description from round one last year. I color coded this, which is not the most accessible thing to do because some folks may have issues with color contrast. So I'm also gonna talk about it. But here at the bottom in yellow, one of the criteria is that the Forest Service is, used to score narratives higher is that applicants who used examples of prior and current partnerships, and Donald mentioned this earlier, which is a good reason why you would want to connect with your local government or forestry units to see what they're already working on. So this applicant mentioned that a few times. So they mentioned the different agencies that they work with and how this particular application is to update the CWPP. It's not a project application, but they did identify the key players in their community, the stakeholders. I just as a sort of a nitpicky thing, if I was writing this brief, I would sort of flip-flop it. I'd feel like they buried the lead a little bit, but this isn't an English class. I'm not critiquing their writing. I really just wanted to give you an example of an application that scored high and go through why it scored high. Let's go down a little bit more. So they made sure to describe how their agency will partner with other agencies. So they said, we recognize that forest land managers, commercial, private, state, and federal, ... They basically outlined the different partners. I'm going to go back up to this criteria. Here they basically outlined how this updating their CWPP will impact the community immediately. They're looking for both short-term and long-term impacts of either updating a CWPP or applying for a project. So they checked that box. They also outlined how the project will impact the community long-term. And something that is not necessarily in that bolded list that they gave you, but it is in the project brief, is in your application, you need to identify how it ties in and addresses the goals of the national cohesive strategy. So they did check that box. And then something that is not in the project brief, and this is something that is the most glaring thing that's not in the project brief, but could improve your could increase your score, is referencing previous wildfires or disasters, in this case, wildfire, that basically illustrate how if your project or if your CWPP had been enabled, like how, or had been in place, how the response to that disaster might have changed. So on that tool that we pointed out earlier, there's a section for severe disaster impacts, and it lists a lot of the severe disasters. And in Minden, looks like there weren't any. You'll basically just go through there and you want to look for a wildfire and talk about how that wildfire impacted the community, and what could have been done to how a CWPP, either having a CWPP in place, engaging these stakeholders, or having a project in place would have impacted that. Go ahead, Jamie.
Sorry, I don't know. You want to finish what you were saying? I was just going to say something that Nancy had mentioned in the chat.
And Megan, it looks like you might be muted.
Oh, thanks, Donald. This applicant also covered scope, which is covered in the project description in the brief, how the project will impact the community immediately. And then they offer a timeline for the project, so looking forward. So this example is the USDA website for the Community Wildfire Defense Grant. They link to this example. But I did just want to quickly walk through, and I'm going to emphasize it one more time, that pay attention to the factors that make narratives score high, and all of the, make sure you're checking all the boxes in your project description, because they they're not the same factors necessarily. You want to hit, in order, I think, to increase your chances of getting a high score on your application, you want to make sure you're doing both, because it's possible to check all the boxes in the project description and still score lower than another application that maybe went above and beyond and with their narrative and addressed some of these factors. So that's kind of the thing that I really wanted to address in this presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Donald. But before we do that, I wanted to, yes. So Nancy has some stuff in the chat.
Yeah, Nancy brings up good points. And then Kevin had a question, and this question is really important to that disaster criteria. Megan, do you mind can you pull up the application, the PDF application?
Sure.
And go down to that question, because there's one part of that that's really important to note when you are looking at those disasters in your community.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get to it. Collaboration, landscape impacts.
It should be the second to last. There we go. So on that question, and you might not be able to see it fully, but there's a second part to this question, which is clearly exhibit how the severe disaster increased wildfire risk and or hazard. So that's a really critical piece there. So not necessarily any disaster will qualify if it's just a disaster. You have to kind of explain how that has increased the wildfire risk and or hazard within your community.
Okay. And then Nancy, along those lines, Nancy mentioned that you can basically just copy and paste that information from previous disasters from that tool, from this tool. Is that right, Nancy?
Yes.
Okay. And then round 2 has a character limitations within certain narrative blocks. That's good to note. I'm wondering is that reflected in the PDF template?
Yeah, it's so like severe disaster impact, there's a 3,000 character limit, including spaces. Okay. So it's important to note that. I don't know if PDF has like a character counter. So one suggestion might be to put it into like a Word document or something else that can tell you the character limits to kind of help with that. Just to make sure you're, and ideally, if you see one that has a ton of character limits, like I think project description has a 9,000 character limit. It's probably, there's a reason behind that, there's probably looking for more of the description in there than maybe some of the other sections.
So this is just a brief overview, but I think there's just like a more in-depth.
Yeah, and this is Nancy. Can I say a word about the disaster?
Yes.
So I want to give an example. So I'm right adjacent to the Caldor burn, and Caldor is fresh in everyone's mind. But if you're going to identify that as the disaster, initially within the first year or two, flooding was a concern, but it hasn't manifest. What has manifest are many, many, many dead and dying snags. So the concern is not going to be flooding. The concern is going to be the amount of snags that remain. So that's an example. Just because it's there doesn't mean it's a disaster, because the disaster, initially has passed. As a matter of fact, now we have one of the best fuel breaks, protecting our area. So there's kind of a good thing on that, but the number of snags is really bad. So that would be how you would address that particular example.
Did we already cover Kevin's question about landslides and flooding?
Yeah, that was kind of going back to making sure that relates to the risk of wildfire.
Thank you. This is Kevin. I thought I'd add some color for us as a group. And Nancy, your comment there was helpful. Looking at the cases where if their fire activity has been present, not at a disaster level, but a next fire activity would arguably create, and the topography is such that you'd have higher likelihood of landslide and a history of storm events with the compounding effect. That was kind of the context to the question. And thank you for the answer.
Yeah, just since we're running low on time, I'm gonna kind of keep us moving us on to things to avoid. But thank you guys for the discussion. I really appreciate it.
And the other slide there, you can check out like low scoring examples. We don't have to cover that, but there's both a high and a low scoring examples, so you can kind of see and compare and contrast those. Things to avoid, I already said this, but it's really important. Don't wait until the last minute. The more time you have dedicated to focus on writing your application, the better. It also allows for our office to be able to provide any feedback to help strengthen your application. So please don't wait till the last minute. The deadline for this, I'm not sure if we said it before, but it is October 31st. There are some, we do have to use this online portal, so you want to put a few days before that date to make sure that we can go through that kind of the formal process as well. So just think about those pieces as you're looking at the timeline for submitting the application. Missing key elements for eligibility is another one. So just double check the requirements in the NOFO. If you're applying for a project, then make sure your community wildfire protection plan has a description of that project within it. Not addressing questions in the NOFO, making sure you answer every single prompt that they have there. Some of the sections that seemed like they scored low last year were accomplishments, collaboration, and project sustainability. Those are towards the bottom of the question, the application. So it might feel like you're kind of getting towards the end. Don't have to necessarily prioritize these sections, but they're very important sections. And even if you're, an HOA that is looking at doing a project yourself, you might have other aspects of it. You might have more than you actually initially think when you start thinking of the larger collaboration that you might have with your fire district or, your homeowners. You might have other partners in the area. So really give that a lot of think for that a lot, because you might have a lot more there than you initially think. And then finally, just not proofreading, checking for any formatting issues. Bullet points don't tend to paste well in the portal, so I usually recommend folks to use paragraph formatting instead. Paragraph formatting also allows you to kind of provide more of your story and to describe every point that you're trying to make better.
Awesome. We have a few things in the chat that we're going to address. This is the slide that Donald mentioned that we were going to show an example of a low scoring narrative, but we'll send this along to you guys after the presentation so you can take a look at that, or you can just go to the CWDG website and take a look at that. But I wanted to open it up for questions, and go ahead.
Oh, you were breaking up.
Oh, I'm sorry. So while we're addressing some things that were in the chat and while we're opening up for questions, I just launched a poll. If you guys could please just participate in that poll. It gives us a good idea of how effective this workshop is and how we can improve things in the future. But let's look at the chat. A few things were brought up. Nancy mentioned, so Nancy, you put some great advice in the chat. Do you want to just emphasize that and maybe
yeah. So because there is this character limitation in some of the response blocks, just be as descriptive and concise as possible. Embedded in the NOFO itself, they talk about the SMART model. So it's just something to keep in mind, to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. The other thing is, if you receive a grant award, you have 5 years to complete the project, up to 5 years if it's a larger scale one. And then when you're doing the character count, keep in mind it's characters, not just word. And sometimes, depending on how your computer does those kinds of things, it doesn't count everything that counts in the character count. So that means also punctuation and spaces.
Awesome. My Zoom is about to freeze. Can you guys hear me at all?
Yeah, we can.
Okay.
I was
but
going to
I can't-
also. Oh,
I
you
can't do anything, so I'm just going to let you guys talk.
Okay. I was also going to add, if you're an applicant in Nevada, another thing to think about is for that 5-year timeline, there are some like Nevada state processing that tends to happen if you do get awarded. And that can take a couple months to get through the whole process. You also want to think about, the seasonal weather, when work can actually be done. So really think about some of those when you're putting together your timeline. Try to think as reasonably as possible, but know that there tends to be a few considerations there. And there's also towards the end of the 5 years, there's usually some closeout things that have to happen. So there's kind of initial and end timeline that you'll have to think about when you're putting together a project.
Awesome.
Hi, this is Jamie with Living with Fire. I'm gonna take over for Megan just for answering questions. And so there's a question, is the PowerPoint going to be available? Maybe we can end up getting a copy of the PowerPoint, Donald, and then emailing it to attendees. Would that be okay?
Yeah, I believe Megan mentioned that she was planning to do that as well. So I think we'll send the PowerPoint and the recording out.
Yes. Yeah. We just have to do a few things to make it accessible, so it won't be available right away. Maybe give us like 5 to 7 business days. If you need it directly, we can email it to you. We just can't post it online without it being accessible. So if you guys need it, like if you want it ASAP, we can just email it to you, but we are going to make it more available in a few days. Hopefully that helps. So Jamie, if you wouldn't mind putting, I think you guys all have my email because I'm the one that hosted the Zoom. So you can either email me, but Jamie, would you mind putting my email in the chat?
Definitely. I put the Living with Fire email, and
Yes.
then I'll do Megan's as well.
Yeah.
And then Donald Berry had left a chat message. He would like you to email him. So maybe you two can, there we go. Perfect.
Yeah, I threw my email in the chat as well. So feel free to send me an email, and happy to talk with you about your community and your needs, and see if it might be a good fit for the Community Wildfire Defense Grant.
Yeah. Awesome. I just want to, before my computer freezes and we get kicked off the meeting, I just want to thank Donald and everyone at NDF for helping to make this happen so quickly. Thank you to Nancy for showing up and offering your expertise. And thank you all for joining and asking great questions. And thank you to Jamie from Living with Fire. She's the manager of Living with Fire program. So thank you for helping make this happen.
Wow.
I think we lost Megan.